My name is Tammy and I'm the coordinator of programs and events for Goldfields Libraries. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today is August the 8th, also Dying to Know Day, which is an annual campaign that seeks to open up healthy conversations about death and dying and to normalise the stigma associated with death. I'm very pleased to welcome as tonight's guest speaker, Melbourne-based writer and author of Found Wanting, Natasha Sholl. Natasha will be introduced and joined in conversation by another Melbourne-based writer in Jonathan Butler. Jonathan's debut novel, The Boy in the Dress, was published in 2022 and shortlisted for the Age Book of the Year in the non-fiction category. So we're pretty lucky tonight. We get two authors. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us tonight, Natasha and Jonathan. I'll hand over to you. I would ask the audience to put yourselves on mute unless you're speaking or asking questions. The chat box is open and you're welcome to put questions in the chat box as well. You can put your view onto gallery, which is where you see everyone, or onto speaker view, which is where you'll see just the speakers. So we'll leave that to you, and I'll hand over to Jonathan now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tammy. Before we get started, Natasha and I are calling in from Melbourne, so we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we both are on, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present. So, as Tammy mentioned, today is Dying to Know Day, which is all about encouraging people to have those tough and brave conversations around death and our preferences for when we go. It's probably safe to say that talking about death doesn't come naturally to many of us here in Australia. In fact, many of us avoid talking about it at all costs. But something that Natasha and I share is that not only have we talked about it, but we've dedicated years of our life to reflect, think about, and commit to paper what death means to us in both our books. Tonight, we're going to talk about Natasha's book, Found Wanting. For those who haven't read it yet, it's a grief memoir. And basically it's about an awful experience that happened to Natasha in her early 20s and the years that followed that. I wrote down some words that I sort of, to describe this book, and it might come as a shock. I described it as a grief memoir, but I've also written down it's brilliant, gripping, exciting, innovative, unexpected. And it really is from a literary sense. When I first heard about it, I was, to be honest, I was quite apprehensive because I wrote a book about my ancestor who died, and I also touch on my experience of my mother dying as well. So the idea of reading a book about grief and death was, I was quite apprehensive, but I shouldn't have been. It's the most amazing book, and it's really, really touching. And I'm incredibly excited to be able to talk to Natasha tonight about it and to get more of her thoughts on writing it, as well as her experience of grief. Cool. So for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to be asking Natasha some questions that I prepared, but there will be time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to use the chat function to drop in your question. And as always, just remember to be respectful and sensitive. It's what we're discussing today takes a lot of bravery. So I think both Natasha and I really appreciate if you consider that before you drop in your question. But we look forward to seeing what you have to ask, Natasha. Great, cool. So to kick us off, Natasha, could you explain to everyone what your book's about?
Sure, and thank you as well for that beautiful introduction. So my book, Found Wanting, is a grief memoir, as you described. It begins on the night that my partner Rob died unexpectedly. We were both I was in my early 20s, he was in his late 20s, and he died in the middle of the night. It was Valentine's Day. We'd gone to bed. He was perfectly healthy, happy. He was actually a doctor. And then the unimaginable happened, and he died next to me in my arms. So it begins on that night, and it is a book about not just grief, but also what happens in the aftermath of grief. So when your life, so you're taken on this sort of trajectory that you just never expected. And I guess it's what happens the day after the worst day of your life.
And so I thought I'd start with my questions, keeping with the theme of Dying to Know Day. You know, it's all about those conversations and talking about death before it comes. And, you know, obviously all of us would love to die of a ripe old age, but obviously that wasn't your experience at all. Shock was a really big part of your experience. You know, it was a big role. And, you know, I really love to know, because you're so young as well, how did you navigate grief in those days and weeks following that really tragic death?
Yeah, and I think the shock was a huge part of it, because it was just something I just was not prepared for. But it's interesting that I think, you know, speaking to people after writing the book, I think we're never really prepared for grief and death. I think even someone who dies at a much older age, or even has battled a long illness, and that you know that that's something that could be just around the corner, I think the reality of grief is so shocking and so unexpected that regardless of what happens, we're still thrown. It's almost like we're picked up and put in this alternate universe that we're just, no matter how much we can prepare for it, we're just not prepared for it. And it really felt like I was just put somewhere else where I didn't speak the language. I didn't know how to use my body properly. Like every part of me went into complete shock and denial and all those things. I had to relearn how to just, you know, have a conversation with someone. I just couldn't comprehend how this had happened, how I'd lost the person I was meant to spend the rest of my life with. And we talk a lot about, you know, what it means to miss someone, but the whole concept was so absurd to me that someone who I'd, you know, gone to bed with that night and we talked about our future just suddenly had disappeared and was no longer there. So I think shock was a lot of it, and just trying to navigate this new world that I found myself in. But I think another element that I found really difficult and quite shocking as well, that, you know, we're talking about the shock of it, was navigating other people and how they perceived me. And because no one knew really how to behave. I mean, I didn't know how to behave, and it was my life. It happened to me, but people didn't know what to do with me or what to say to me. So it was sort of this dual thing of me wanting to make sure other people felt comfortable. They wanted to make sure I felt comfortable. And it was this real interplay of just no one knew what to do, let alone me.
Interesting. And so you mentioned then you sort of were thrust into this world that you didn't quite know how to navigate. And one thing that I really love about your book is that it's such a vivid insight into the worlds in which you were at the time and still are. So, you know, you're a young unmarried woman at the time. You know, both you and Rob were from middle-class Jewish families. I know I've heard you speak before around those societal expectations, and there's a lot of right and wrong things to do in these, you know, scenarios. Mm-hmm. So I really love to hear you reflect on, I guess, those sort of aspects of identity and how did that shape your experience of death?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think being Jewish, that isn't necessarily something that informed my sort of everyday life. I mean, it was part of my upbringing, but it's not something I sort of thought about on a day-to-day basis. But the second that I was sort of thrown into this mourning process, it was literally one of the first things I looked towards, like, well, what do I do now? And then I looked towards religion to sort of tell me what to do. And we followed those grieving practices, like in traditional Jewish mourning. There's sort of 7 days of, you know, in the immediate aftermath, it's called sitting Shiva, where people come to the house of the person who is mourning, and there's sort of like this ritualized aspect to it. Things happen very quickly, but it means that you don't have to think about what to do because you're told what to do straight away. You show up to the person's house, the funeral is quite quick. You're meant to talk about the person, you're meant to say their name, you're meant to comfort the people who are grieving, you're meant to bring them food and tell stories. So it is that in the direct aftermath, I think I did turn to religion, which was interesting because it wasn't something that was sort of part of my day-to-day existence. But then, you know, in the same way that I found comfort in those mourning in that sort of mourning, those ritualized mourning things, I also it was part of my anger towards a God who I hadn't necessarily had a direct conversation with for a long time, but I guess I didn't know where to throw my anger. So it was, that contradiction of I looked to religion for comfort, but then it was also, well, why did this happen? And there were all these questions again that religion couldn't answer.
And have you, spoken to someone and heard about their experiences and been struck by how different it was because of that aspect of religion, or the fact that you were an unmarried younger woman, or is there some more similarities than one might expect?
Yeah, I think, I had friends at the time who weren't Jewish and they were a bit shocked about what was happening. They kept asking questions like, well, why is everyone coming over? And why is everyone coming with quiche and vanilla slices? Like, it just seemed so absurd to them. But to me, it was just so normal. And it's funny looking through other people's eyes and you're like, oh, I get it now. This is something that I've been brought up with, and to me is so normal and natural, but to other people it's a bit weird. But then at the same time, because we technically weren't married, I sort of, according to the Jewish religion, I was sort of not the immediate family. So technically I wasn't one of that inner circle of mourners. So I felt that sort of rejection from that kind of religious background, because we'd planned to get married, we planned to live a life together, we were living together, and it was this double slap of, well, technically, according to the Jewish religion, I'm not in that inner circle of mourners, and the same sort of rules don't apply to me of how I was treated by society. And everyone was lovely, everyone was trying their best. It was just that sense of I'd lost, it was another loss. It was that loss of validation of, yes, you did what we meant to each other. So that was also quite difficult for me to navigate at the time.
I also am quite interested in time. And so this experience that you've written about happened when you were 22. So, you've been writing that book in the years since then. I'm really curious, would you say that your relationship with Rob and your relationship with that time of your life has changed over that 20, don't want to say anything out of line here, but in those 20-ish years since then?
Yeah, so I don't think I could have written this book in the direct aftermath of that. I think I was still trying to come to terms with all these things, and it was only since 2019, so quite a while. Rob died in 2005, so it was quite some time between going through that grieving process and then having the courage to sit down and write that book. And I think part of it for me was being scared. There were a lot of things I was scared about writing the book, but one of them was being scared about what I'd find out about myself, really. Like, what if I still was longing for that life and I wasn't happy with the life I was living now? And what would happen if I really, acknowledged those feelings of grief that for a while I'd sort of pushed below the surface. And I think there was part of me that was worried that once I spoke the truth about my grief, that it would just completely overwhelm me. And that was something I struggled with at the time as well. Like, if I did, cry or express my emotions, I shut off quite quickly because I was so worried that it was so much that I just would never stop. And the reality is it's not. When we give our grief permission to come to the surface, we can deal with those emotions in a much healthier way than I did at the time. So yeah, it's part of the book, and that it's not like a spoiler, but I, am in a loving marriage now, and I did have to learn how to love again after that. It wasn't something I planned for or prepared for. I sort of thought when I lost Rob, well, that's it. I've lost the person I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and that's it. I had no plans to enter into another relationship, but I did find love. And so my relationship, it was sort of difficult to navigate. Well, what do I do with that love for the person who's no longer here, but also love the life that I have no choice but to live now, So it is a complicated thing that I sort of had to write through to find the answer.
Amazing. So the reason why Dying to Know Day exists is probably because we're all not great at talking about it and knowing what to do when someone in our life, goes through this sort of awful experience. You've already mentioned some more humorous responses that always involve a quiche or a vanilla slice. But I think maybe some people tuning in today would love to hear from you. What what were some things that you actually found really helpful and potentially not so helpful that we could potentially learn from if we're in a sort of situation where a loved one has gone through something like this?
Yeah, I think when someone is going through, like, who's mourning or grieving, it's that automatic human response of we want to take their pain away. And it's totally understandable. Like, if someone is going through that much pain, of course we want to help them. But what we sort of do, it's also human nature, is to then try and minimize their pain. So let's say someone has lost a partner, we can say, well, you can find love again. Whereas that doesn't actually take away their pain. I think what helped me was when people just acknowledged what I was going through and didn't try to minimize it, didn't try to say, oh, well, you're young. Because when people said, oh, well, you're young, that made me feel like, well, I have my whole life ahead of me and the worst thing has just happened and I don't know how I'm going to survive tomorrow, let alone this whole life ahead of me. Or when people said, well, you can find someone else. It was like, well, I don't want someone else. I want Rob because he just died and I miss him and I love him. And, so that's, people try and at least it is what I call it. So, oh, well, at least you're young. At least you can find love again. At least you had some time together. And it's like, well, that doesn't help. How about you validate it and say, I'm so sorry you're going through this. Just acknowledge the grief, acknowledge their pain, which actually people think, well, I don't want to make it worse, but actually that makes it better because it gives that person to permission to feel the feelings that they're feeling, which is quite liberating and freeing, just to know that however you're grieving, however you're feeling is okay. And I think another element I was quite conscious of is I didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And I just felt a lot of responsibility, to not be a burden. And so people would sometimes offer me things, and if I didn't feel like it on that day, so they might say, well, let's go for coffee or let's go for a walk. And I sort of thought, well, if I don't say yes now, they're never going to ask again. When the reality is, I think people should know that if on one day you need to stay in bed and fall apart, that's okay. And then the next day you might actually need to go out and get some fresh air and go for a walk, and that's fine too. Like, grief, the whole landscape, it's so fast changing, and what works on one day may not work on another day. And I just think people need permission to know that you'll be there no matter what, and no matter what they're going through, and whatever mood or feelings they're going through on one day, that you'll be there the next day and the next day and the next day. Like, I was worried, well, they'll disappear tomorrow because I know what I'm going through is too much for someone. So just to know that you're never too much, I think would be a massive relief for people.
And sticking on that idea of minimizing pain, I know that totally different experience, but when my mother died, she was of a disease. It was an awful disease, but it was over 9 years. So it was quite a long period. I knew the day was coming. And I had this idea that, to build up my emotional armor, I actually taught myself how to meditate as a way beforehand. So when it came to pass, that hopefully that would really help me. Is there anything that, looking, hindsight would help people sort of minimize that pain, or, anything proactive that they can do?
Yeah, I also turn to meditation. I don't think it's for everyone, but I think it's that thing of whatever works for you on any given day. So for me, yoga is something I find really powerful. I just need to move my body. I think I felt so disconnected from my body. I was quite self-sabotaging in that way as well at the time. A lot of the hatred, and I felt so out of control, I sort of turned in on myself. And one of the ways that I sort of regained that connection, and sort of, because you disassociate a lot, I think, when you're grieving. So one of the ways I sort of, resumed that relationship with my body and stopped sabotaging it was through yoga and movement. And I literally had to, I think the first yoga session that I ever went back to was literally like, he taught me how to walk again, how to feel the floor, how to ground myself. And so it was almost like literal baby steps to reintegrate back into society. So yeah, I think you just give yourself permission that maybe you're not the type of person who can sit there and meditate, but you can find something else that gives you that same feeling and that same connection to your body, or that same connection to your breath. Like, I have another friend who, her father died, and she finds it quite difficult when people tell her to focus on her breath. She has a bit of a panic attack because it makes her think of losing her breath. So, whereas for me, it has the opposite. I need to really focus on my breath and that movement. So yeah, I think it's that thing of, it's different for everyone, and however you manage that is okay. There's no one right way. You're not failing at grief if you don't know how to meditate, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned before as well, you found love again and you have a wonderful family of your own now. I've been lucky enough to meet your husband a few times. He is such a cheerleader, and I imagine it was pretty amazing having him in your corner while you're writing this very difficult book. I wanted to ask you, has your experience with death changed how you approach the topic with your loved ones now?
Yeah, especially because it is just part of our day-to-day conversation. It is a reality. So my kids know about Rob. They know that I was in a relationship before and that my partner died young and that it was very sad, and that their father, Dean, is someone I fell in love with after that, and that he took care of me. And so it's a normal part of their life. And honestly, for kids, I think their parents' lives are quite boring. So for them, they're just indifferent to the whole thing. They just find it quite a non-event. But it is something that we talk about, over the dinner table. And especially since the book's come out, it's a bit more, people say to their kids like, oh, what's your mum's book about? And they're like, oh, it's about grief. It's about death. Like, they're quite young, but that's the conversation. They're the conversations that they're having. And so death is normalized as an event that happens, and their valid feelings that it is something that is sad and that is something to be talked about, and they have questions about it, and that's fine. They know that I'm open to talking about it, because I would much rather them ask a question, even if it's an awkward question or something that someone else might find is like an inappropriate question, whatever. I'd rather we just say it and be able to talk about the truth of what it means to lose someone, so that you don't have questions. You're not left wondering, well, what does that mean?
I have a few more writing questions. As a fellow writer, I definitely want to know. So your book is full of very visceral experiences, and you've already sort of touched on it. Grief is a bodily experience. You also are very honest with a lot of your internal thoughts, those sort of intrusive and shameful thoughts that you experienced. There's also little snippets of very specific, absurd, darkly funny interactions that you have, as well as superstitions. You sort of muse on a lot of superstitions like reincarnation, prophecies, lucky charms, that sort of thing. You've described the book as a grief memoir. I'd love to know, what was that process like of knowing what to include and potentially what not to include? Because it's a really fascinating mix of, sort of little snippets and insights.
Yeah, and I think that's why I probably couldn't have written this book so close to the time it happened. It was almost like I wasn't consciously writing it, but it was going around and around in my head. And so people sort of said to me, oh, did you have notes from the time? Did you keep a journal? Did you keep a diary? Because a lot of the memories are quite specific, but I didn't. And so when I sat down and I was like, I'm writing this book, and it's not a book about me personally who lost Rob. It is a book about grief, and I want to uncover what that means, what it means to grieve, what it means to lose someone. And so that was the sort of lens that allowed those memories to come through. So what parts of that story spoke to the experience of grief? And I sort of thought, if someone else was reading this book and had lost a parent, a sibling, a partner, a child, would this speak to their experience? Would it feel true to them? Not that the events would happen in the same way, but would they be able to connect to that feeling of grief? So I think that's the lens that I saw everything through. And I also think part of it was that when I lost Rob, I was quite young. And so I sort of turned to the literature of like, well, is what I'm feeling normal? Is this okay? I was very conscious of, am I doing this right? Because I felt like I was just untethered and going a bit insane. And there just wasn't that experience that spoke to me that said, you will go numb and you won't be able to hear proper conversations because your brain will just switch off at some points, or you won't be able, they're the elements of, insomnia and how you connect to your friendship groups and like all things like that I just, and the elements of shame, because I felt quite a lot of shame that something happened in my life and my life took a direction that I had no control over it. So I just thought, what if there was that book that just let it all out and was just completely truthful and spoke to that experience of grief? So that was sort of the lens that I had everything through. Did it speak to the experience of grief as a universal concept, even though it was through my personal experience? And then even though this was a book that I did hope to get published one day, I had to write it as if no one would ever read it, because most of what's in there I don't think I necessarily would have written had I expected to be on a Goldfields Library Zoom session talking to a whole group of strangers. So yeah, I had to just write it and put it all out there. And then I think by writing it, I lost that sense of shame a bit, because it was out there in the world, and it was almost like I was reading someone else's experience of it, and I could distance myself from it a little bit. And yeah, so that was how I was able to write it. And the memories just came through on their own. And there are parts of the book where I say, look, I don't know if this is exactly how it happened, but isn't it interesting that I've forgotten this major detail? Like, I don't remember the weather on the day that Rob died, when it was his funeral. I don't remember the feeling of the weather, but I remember the last meal we ate together. So why are some memories important? Why do some memories come through all these years later and some disappear? So it is that element of not my particular experience specifically, but that specific experience of memory, of grief, what it does to our minds, what it does to our bodies.
And I think that that self-awareness, you know, how you mentioned then you don't remember necessarily, and you're very upfront about that in the book. And I think there's also some little anecdotes that you clearly, you know, you want to include it, but it isn't necessarily clear like what that relationship to grief necessarily is, but it has impacted how you acted. Or one of the anecdotes that really stuck with me was the morning that you went for a run and you had a very weird interaction. For some reasons, it's really stuck with me, and it just sort of, each chapter is, you know, so unique. And then, you know, all together, it just creates a really, really, you know, fascinating sort of account of grief.
Yeah.
Reminder to the audience to think of some questions. I'm keeping an eye on the chat here. I'm happy to read them out. So just drop them in and I'll read them out for Natasha when we get to that. Another sort of writing question. So at the start of the book, you know, you provide us with a few little romantic glimpses of Rob. And when I was reading it, I was expecting it to be, you know, there's going to be a bit of forward, back, and that I was sort of going to get this very comprehensive picture of who he was and what your relationship was. But it wasn't that, and that his absence was really felt through the book. And I really want to hear how you manage that technically. How did you manage to write an absence, you know, and how you tackle that technical challenge?
Yeah, I'd love to say that I purposely did that and my technical craft was obviously honed, but I think, and that was one of the reasons that prevented me from writing for so long, because I was worried about doing justice to Rob as a human being and to write him and the essence of him, because how can words ever capture someone that you've got that connection to who's no longer here? So I think that was one of the things that did actually stop me from writing. And then when I just thought, well, I'll just try my best. And I think that absence was the thing that did anchor the book. And funnily, the first person who read the full manuscript was my husband, Dean. And one of the first things he said was, I mean, he had to give his approval, obviously, because it's our relationship that a lot of it is talking about, but he was so supportive and he was so moved by the book, and he just said, it's beautiful, it's perfect. But one of the first things he said was, you have to capture Rob. He was so charismatic. You know, he'd walk into a room and everyone would turn around. So it was this interesting interplay of the person that I'm in a relationship with now and married to, sort of looking out for the person that this book started with, and how we were sort of all caring for each other and making sure that we paid tribute to each other and respected each other's memories and the place that we hold for each other.
I also want to ask, after my mother passed, I was seeing a therapist, and one thing that he said was, because of that long time of worrying about death for, you know, as I said, it was sort of a 10-year process, that you've been thinking about death for a very long time, and it's time you think about life and creation. And it really, you know, I've often pondered, like, what has the impact been of writing a book about death for 10 years for myself? And I'm curious if you've sort of also thought about that question of that, you know, prolonged sort of experience, and, you know, what sort of impact has that had on you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that our relationship with grief and our connection to grief and death and thinking those thoughts, we sometimes mix them up with our relationship to the person who's died. So for me, a lot of that sort of almost obsessive thinking about grief and death was because I felt like, well, that was my connection to Rob, and that was my connection to the person no longer here. And so therefore, if I did sort of reintegrate into the life fully and I stopped those obsessive thoughts about grief and death, that therefore I wasn't still connected to the person who was no longer here. So it's taken me some time to know how to honor their memory and still have that relationship and that connection to them and grieve them without obsessively thinking about grief, because they're probably two separate things. And part of this book was about, how to live the life that we have with the knowledge that there is this sort of unlived life sort of humming beneath the surface, and how to make sense of those sort of multitudes of lives that are within us all. So I think for me, it was, I sort of haven't let go of the grief, but I have let go of that sort of obsessive thinking about it.
So we've had a few questions. I'll just start with the one I can see now. You mentioned you turned to religion at first. Did it help? Has it had a continuing influence on you?
I think that it definitely helped at the time. I think the Jewish morning rituals are quite intuitive in terms of they exist to really center the people who are at the center of that morning process. Like, they're quite intuitive in that way. It's not something that I connect with on a day-to-day level, but I do feel like it definitely helped my grief process at the time.
We have a question here that's more around the writing process. So how did you decide what to include, exclude? What order to put things in? How did you group them? Was there pushback from anyone about you publishing your book?
Yeah, so I definitely was worried about pushback, which is, again, one of the reasons I probably didn't write straight away. But then when like what we spoke about before, when I wrote a book that was about grief, almost like grief was this character in the book, obviously I had to include other people in the book because it's about my experience, but I never wanted to speak for anyone else's experience of grief, because grief is, it's so individual. I didn't want to talk about anyone else's relationship with people who had died. That's their story to tell. It's not my story to tell. So I guess that's how I decided what to include or exclude. If there was anything that didn't put people in a good light, then I just excluded it, because it's not a burn book. It's not my place to say anything that's not kind about anyone. So it was, I guess the first question was, does it need to be said for the context of the book? In which case it went in. If it was unnecessary, it went out. If it didn't put people in a good light, then it went out. Obviously, the person who is shown in probably the worst light is myself. So, my treatment of myself was pretty ruthless. It was just all out there. And sort of once I started that, I didn't even have to think about it. I just spoke to my truth, and I spoke to the truth of grief, and it sort of naturally found its own shape. There wasn't really pushback specifically. I was worried about what my family would think, and they sort of only read the book just before it was published, and they were just so overwhelmingly kind and supportive. And because people might have known part of what happened, but no one knew every element. No one knows really the whole story as it was laid out like that. So there was a lot of empathy and compassion, and people were generous in letting me tell their involvement in my life as well.
We've had a question that someone wants to know a bit more about that running encounter, but perhaps that's probably not quite that appropriate to share now. So you're just going to have to buy or hire or rent
things.
But the other question that we did have that I was going to ask you was around the book. Have you read On Death and Dying and the 5 Stages model?
Yes, I have. And there are several references in the book about the stages of grief. And I think part of my issues when I started grieving was a misunderstanding of those stages of grief. So I thought I was meant to go through them one at a time and then pop out the other side and I'd be all fixed and maybe even a better person. And when that didn't happen, I I felt again like I was doing grief wrong. And so then it took me a while to understand, like, they're not stages that you go through on this sort of trajectory and come out the other side all healed. It's this sort of reference point that you'll dip in and out of different stages. You'll go through them in a different order. And there's now, which is also in my book, there's now another stage, which is meaning. So it's the 5 stages of grief. And David Kessler, who was involved in those initial stages with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, he lost his son quite recently, and he was looking at the stages that he'd helped develop, and he sort of felt like it didn't cover everything, and he added the 6th stage, which was meaning, which at first I was quite uncomfortable with, because in my head I was like, well, there's no meaning behind the death. I've just spent all these years making peace with the fact that there doesn't have to be meaning, that sometimes bad things just happen and that's it. But I guess it's more about, well, what the meaning isn't in the death itself. The meaning is what you do with your life now. And so that's how I've come to sort of make sense of the stages of death and look for meaning now. So the meaning for me is my connection with the people no longer here, my connection with the people who supported me through that time, you know, the connection I have now with my family. So yes, that book specifically did inform a lot of what I wrote about.
Great. We have another question around the coincidences, lucky charms, throughout the book, the sort of spooky coincidences. It's a bit of a running theme throughout the book. Can you talk a little bit about including them and why?
Sure. So I think part of Jewish religion as well, it's quite a superstitious religion. So we've got, you know, the evil eye, where you can't sort of say good things, otherwise something bad might happen. And, you know, people knock on wood and they spit, and they're, you know, things like that happen all the time. So it's a big part of my upbringing. And so for me, that those superstitious things were just part of who I was as a person. But then when I sat down to write the book, there were a lot of elements with sort of grief and shame that were interwoven throughout. And they did have to do with sort of coincidences and superstition. So, for example, I was doing a creative writing degree in my early university days as sort of part of my arts law degree. And one of the subjects, we had to write the beginning stages of a novel. And, you know, Rob and I were, I think at that stage, we'd been going out together for maybe a year or so. And I decided to write, I don't know why, about the concept of grief. And I wrote a completely fictionalized account about someone whose partner dies in the middle of the night. And they died in very similar circumstances to how Rob died. So that when he did die, I looked back on this piece of writing and I thought, oh my God, I've somehow caused it, because I wrote this a year before he died. And I literally wrote about a woman whose partner died in the middle of the night in his sleep. Like, what are the chances of that? If, you know, if I was writing a piece of fiction now and I included that, someone would probably say, well, that's not really believable. That probably wouldn't, you know, your readers wouldn't believe that that would happen. But I guess I wanted to draw attention to the fact that life is really weird and it is really absurd, and coincidences like that do happen. And in some ways, they lead to these conversations like that we have about death and grief, because they open up these conversations. And like, so a week, was it about 2 weeks before Rob died, was the Boxing Day tsunami. And we were watching TV and we were watching all the footage, and Trisha Broadbridge, who was on her honeymoon when her husband died, was on television. And I turned to Rob and I said, if something happened to you, I would never survive it. And he looked at me and said, you wouldn't want to, but you would. And it was this eerie moment in hindsight, because I was in my early 20s. Rob was perfectly fit and healthy. There was no reason we should have been talking about the fact if something would have happened to him or if he would die. And yet here we are just a few weeks before his death, and we'd had this conversation, which I think is a lot of what Dying to Know Day is. It is having these conversations and opening up to the serendipities of life and these coincidences and these conversations that we do have. And I'm so grateful for that conversation, because it did inform me later on of when I was struggling. I thought, well, how am I meant to go on? You know, I had his voice in the back of my head that said, you wouldn't want to, but you have to keep going.
That's lovely. You mentioned around part of the meaning that you found was the family connection piece. And I think, you know, in a big part, your book is a bit of an ode and like a thank you to the people that really supported you through that. One of the interesting elements of your book and of grief in general is the relationships that shape that grief. And you cover a few different relationships through that. So obviously, Rob and you yourself were boyfriend and girlfriend. Another shocking death happened in your family. So then you experienced it as a sister. But you also talked about thinking about your mother and how she felt with her son. So yeah, I'd love to hear how you think that sort of that relationship and how that can shape the grief experience.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of what got me through those early stages, especially when I lost, Rob as a girlfriend, were the friendships and the people that just continued to show up. And, my parents who were just sort of there for me, who had to almost reparent me. I had to move back home. I sort of completely just went backwards in developmentally. I was just, like a teenager living back home. I needed all that support. And then, later in the book, my brother died quite suddenly. And so it was that weird thing where I was grieving the loss of my brother, but I was also grieving for him as a person, because I felt so bad for him that he was no longer here and he was missing out on his, beautiful children and his wife. And then I was also grieving for my parents who lost a son, and their pain was just palpable. So it was this weird thing where it wasn't just my grief anymore. I was grieving, for my other brother who was still living, who's older. So I was taking on this sort of family grief as well, and feeling for them and wanting to take away their pain while also experiencing my own pain.
I wrote down earlier when you were talking about writing it and how you just wanted to let it all out and sort of just relinquish that control. But I do remember reading on your Twitter once that when you were a young girl and you had a play date with a friend, you this is in the public domain, so I assume it's okay to mention, you practiced getting in and out of a car just because you're so nervous about that experience when you go on a play date later that day or something. So, I think the idea of control and, that sort of wanting to have a sense of control in your life, but obviously grief is a time of your life where you just lose all that control. So yeah, how did that sort of aspect of your personality, I suppose, play into your experience, at the time and throughout this whole experience writing the book as well?
Yeah, I think as that tweet would show, I was a highly strung, highly anxious child. And that hasn't really changed. But I think it's interesting because part of so much of grief was being out of control, but then so much of the publishing process as well was out of my control. Like, I couldn't control how people would respond to the book. And once it was published and out there, I had to accept that it was completely out of my hands and it was no longer my business. However someone wanted to deal with the content of the book, that was their right. It was no longer my business anymore. And then in the same way, it was almost no longer my story anymore, because I had committed it to paper and then put it out there, and it didn't belong to me anymore. Like, this thing that had been in my head for so long and was quite private and solitary was then no longer mine to claim. So I had to sort of give away ownership of that grief story in some ways.
And did you feel that helped, that relinquishing of the control, or is that still a little bit challenging?
Every time I sort of do an event or do a podcast, I spiral a little bit, just because I think, well, I don't know, it's so personal, and, what if I don't say it quite right, or what if I don't explain myself properly, or what will people think of me? But then, I've had so many lovely messages afterwards where someone else will say, that's exactly how I felt. Or, when I lost whatever the relationship was, I went through the exact same thing. So I think it has been quite a validating experience, and just knowing that other people connect with the experience that I put down on paper. And can I ask you a question,
Okay.
Because,
sure.
because your book as well is a lot to do with death and grief, but also you're writing a story that you didn't necessarily know all the answers to. So how did you choose what to include and what not to include in your?
Yeah, it was challenging. So yeah, my book, The Boy in the Dress, is about my grandmother's cousin who was mysteriously murdered during World War II in 1944. So a long time ago, but his death had a very profound impact on my grandmother, who then had a profound impact on my mother, and then who had a profound impact on me as well. The main reason it had an impact on me is because there was a family rumor that he was gay and that it was a gay hate crime. So, that was very scary to learn when I was young and in the closet. So yeah, there was a lot of unknowns around that. And I actually had a similar approach to you, at least for the memoir sections of the book, where it was just letting it all out and writing everything that I could possibly think, not even remotely thinking about it as a published piece at all, for better or for worse. So yeah, I think there was that, and then just really carving it back, and I think because mine's more about sort of the people in my family, my world. So there was a lot of interviews and digging a bit deeper into that and reaching out to as many people as I can, holding on to any sort of tidbits in the archives as well. But yeah, it's it can be challenging as to sort of, and I had a similar experience around, not everyone experiences the same thing the same way. So, memoir is that person's experience. So I did try and remind myself of that as well. Now back to you.
I'm just deflect.
Yeah. We're running out of time quickly, but I do want to ask this one last question. In writing your book, were there any other books or art forms that you turned to that helped you craft it?
Yeah, so I read The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, like probably at least yearly since the year Rob died. And so it was one of those things where I turned back to in the writing of this book, and I did see it was actually, the copy I have was actually published the year of his death. So it was this other thing of like, well, where did I even discover this book, and what's the synchronicity of it was literally published at that time that I was experiencing grief. And I think part of that was the reason I connected with it. I mean, she lost her husband in, much later stage of life, but I think the reason I connected to it was that magical thinking. And there is a stage where I think, I can't remember if it was like shoes or a coat, but she can't give it away because he might come back, because her husband who died, he might need his stuff. And it was this weird, the tricks that we play with our minds. And I connected with that so much. So all these weird thoughts that I'd have. So if something happened, I'd want to call, my brother who died, if something weird happened, I'd reflexively just call my phone to tell him something weird that happened when I knew that it was related to his death. And even the fact that I was wanting to call him about his death, it just seemed completely normal to me. So I think that element of magical thinking and the weirdness and the absurdity of grieving, I connected with a lot. And then I guess in writing the book, I think music helped me a lot, just to tap into those emotions. And sometimes I just needed to, almost skip the thinking part of my brain and just go into that bodily sensation of writing and write without thinking. And I think music helped me connect a lot to that.
And I loved that section that you actually included lyrics from a song, because it was kind of like a great reading experience, because you could kind of hear the song as you're reading as well. So it was really a clever sort of technique that you used there. I think we've run out of time. Just want to say thank you so much, Natasha. There's been lots of thank yous in the chats as well. Obviously, it's not a easy topic to talk about. It's been a big year for you, and I know that you have to do this a lot and sort of revisit and talk about a really, really difficult time. So very, very grateful and appreciative for your honesty and openness. It's an absolutely amazing book. Everyone has to buy it and read it, or get it from the library. You won't regret it. It's really special. And I think everyone says it, but you pick it up and then you put it down. You're like, oh my God, where did that go? It only takes like maximum a day. But it's really, really stuck with me. And I read it months ago when it first came out. So yeah, everyone has to go check it out. And yeah, thank you for tuning in, everyone. I'll hand back over to Tammy.
I'm just going to jump in and say thank you to Jono for today, and thank you to everyone for coming. It's really special to be able to connect with readers, and especially people who love their local library and their local bookstores. It really means a lot. And thank you to Tammy and Goldfields Library for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Natasha. That was a really special conversation and very appropriate for this day. Thank you for sharing your story, Natasha and Jonathan. And I think there'll be a lot of interest in your books as a result of this conversation. Thank you to everyone for coming along. And just to let you know that we will be putting this talk on our Goldfields Library's YouTube channel. So if you've got any friends or family you think might enjoy it, get them to have a look. thank you very much, and we'll see you all again another time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.